Good evening. Welcome to tonight's shir on this Sunday of Parshas Nosoi. And so we'll go straight into our questions. So last Friday night, that is not 2 nights ago, but a week ago. So a young rabbi who has a shul nearby, and he is the only one in his shul who can do maftir, who do the haftarah. So every week he has maftir. But his problem was that the Shabbos there is the Teichacha. And for the Teichacha, it is our custom that the Balkoira has that aliyah. So he's going to have the aliyah of Teichacha, and then maftir. So does he have a double? Does he have 2 aliyahs in the one morning? Is that the solution? Or alternatively, could he call up one of his congregants who will say for maftir, they will say the brachas, and the rabbi would read the actual maftir, the actual haftarah rather. So these are this couple of options which he was suggesting, which would be better. Now I'm going to tell you, I told him better to take 2 aliyahs rather than giving someone else the maftir and him taking over for actual reading for the Navi. But thanks to this shir, I had the impetus to look into it more carefully, and perhaps I think I should have told him differently. So I want to discuss with you what are the issues involved here. So we have here the 2 addresses where this is discussed is in Simon Reish Pei Daled and Reish Pei Beis. Reish Pei Beis is about Kriyas HaTorah on Shabbos. Reish Pei Daled is about Maftir, Haftorah. All right, so we have here a rule, which is Hamaftir Benovi Sorich Sheyikra B'Torah Tchila. Before someone is going to stand up in public and read from the prophets, so he has to first have an aliyah, has to read from the Torah first, and say the attendant brachas before and after, after which he will then read from the Novi. And the reason for this, why can't another person be honored to read from the Novi? It shouldn't be that the honor of the Torah and the honor of the Novi are placed on the same level. If the last fellow will be reading only in Novi, just they had an aliyah in Sefer Vayikra, and he has an aliyah in Sefer Yeshaya. It would put Yeshaya and Vayikra on the same pedestal, and therefore there is an emphasis that he has to first read from Novi, and then read from the Torah, and then he can read from Novi. Therefore, for the Balkoire to call up one of his congregants for maftir, and the rabbi himself would take over for haftorah, but how can he take over for haftorah if he didn't read the Novi, he didn't read for the Torah just before? Now, this is not so poshut, because I know that in the Litvische circles, Talmidei, followers of the Vilna Gaon, there it's a standard thing that they call up one of the Pecan community for maftir, and the Balkoire does the haftorah. The reason for this is because the Vilna Gaon introduced to have handwritten scrolls of Novi, like you have a Megillas Esther, you have a scroll of Yeshaya, a scroll of Yirmiyah, etc. Scrolls of I guess it's at least 7 scrolls Meshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Malachim, that's 4. And then you've got Shai, Yirmiyah, Yechezkel, and Treos, so it'd have to be 8 scrolls. So the Vilna Gaon reintroduced perhaps, the used scrolls for reading the Haftarah. Just a second. The handwritten scrolls, wouldn't have the vowels, certainly not the notes, the trop. And therefore, most people of the community are not able to read the Novi from the scroll. And therefore, the Balkoira, who's qualified to prepare the parsha, he also reads the Novi for them. So how do they get around this? We said that it's imperative before you read Novi to have read in the Torah. So how do they get around it? Is that there's someone that the Balkoira does the reading from the Novi on their behalf. So here you have in front of you from the Mishnah Brura. Then this is in Simresh Pei Daled. He addresses this, and he's actually, I can see he has quoted from the Chayei Adam. So it's almost word for word from the Chayei Adam. Nowadays, the minig is in some places, lichtov, to write the Nevi'im on parchment, or beglila and scroll like a Sefer Torah. If so, hakoire benovi, who moitzi kol hatzibur kekriyas Sefer Torah. He throws in a comment, which is a little bit puzzling. He throws in a comment that the one who's reading Novi, he's moitzi the congregation, like if he's been reading from the Torah. Velochen, therefore, afilu lechatchila muter likros lemaftir. Therefore, it's even lechatchila permitted to call up for maftir someone who is unable to read the Novi himself. Dehu yoyim kol habrachas. So the congregant will read the brachas of the Haftorah before and after. V'hashliach tzibur, and the Balkoire will read the Haftorah just like he read from the Sefer Torah. So clearly, I mean, this is, as I said, the Chayei Adam is saying in our Kehillah in Vilna, although I don't know, he lived I thought he lived in Danzig, but at any rate, he writes in our Kehillah that we've introduced to use parchment scrolls for Novi, so it's been introduced that the Balkoira does the Haftarah. Now, but then I looked at it and thought it's very straightforward. It's very straightforward because, like this, what will we say? That it's imperative that whoever reads from the Novi has to have read from the Torah. Now, you call up Yankel Reich for Maftir, and then he comes to the Haftarah. So Yankel Reich did not read the Torah because it was the Balkoira that did the Torah. Yankel Reich doesn't read the Novi because the Balkoira reads the Novi. So as far as the brachas is concerned, Yankel Reich made a bracha here and bracha there. As far as the actual reading, the Balkoira read here, the Balkoira reads there. So what's the problem? Either way, the one who has a privilege in Novi had the same privilege in the Torah. Therefore, it's a problem solved. Actually, what's bothering me is, you're reading these words of the Alter Rebbe, the one who reads the Novi has to have read in the Torah. Actually, we don't do that. Most of us, if we're called up for Maftir and Haftorah, yes, we're capable of reading the Haftorah with the trop from the printed volume, but we don't read from the Torah. It's the Balkoira who's reading from the Torah. So how are we fulfilling this halacha of the one who reads Novi has to have first read in the Torah? When I didn't read in the Torah, it was the Balkoira. Okay, so I murmured along with him quietly, a little bit schwach. How did we fulfill this? Occurred to me, this is actually what is being said here in this line in the Mishnah Brura, which, as I said, is the words of Chayei Adam. The Balkoira is reading on behalf of the tzibur. So therefore, he says like this: when I'm reading in Sefer Yeshaya, I'm doing it on your behalf. You had the Aliyah in Vayikra, and I read it for you. And true, and now I'm reading for you from Sefer Yeshaya. That's not a problem. So let me now switch this the other way around. I had Aliyah from Maftir, but I did not learn in the Torah. But actually, the Balkoida who read, he was moitzi me. When he read the Maftir in Sefer Vayikra, he did it on my behalf. Okay, so I did read in the Torah. Of course, he was moitzi everyone, but particularly when I stood up there and I said the brachas, and he read, he was reading on my behalf. So I did read in the Torah vicariously through him. Okay, so then I was quoted by Torah, and therefore I'm allowed to read from the Navi. Good. So that's the normal thing. But now to call in a third person, neither the Balkoida nor the Mr. Maftir, calling a third person to come and take over to read the Haftorah, that is problematic. So then you have the scenario that Reuven buys Maftir Yoino for £900, but he can't read it. Shimon can read it, but he doesn't have £900. So then they do make a partnership. I'll pay and you'll read. That's not okay, because Shimon cannot read Maftir Yoino unless he read before that in the Chumash, in the Chumash, right? So now, coming back to the question which was asked, I've read the Teichacha, and now it comes to Maftir. Can I give one of the congregants the Aliyah of Maftir, and I will take over to read the text of the Novi? And the answer is yes, because I read in the Torah also. Okay, so I read for you, so I'm reading the Torah for you. So either way, it's the same thing. Okay, that's the way I think it is legitimate, contrary to what I'd said to the fellow on the Friday night. Now, just one more thing. Reading in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, so he has here the following statement: if there's no one in the shul who can say Maftir, unless besides any of the 7 who had an Aliyah, so then one of the 7 should have Maftir. The fact that he read Shlishi or Revi or even Shvi does not count, because Kaddish has been said in between. All right, so again, if there's no one else in the shul, you had 7 Aliyahs, and then the other 3 gentlemen are not able to do Maftir, so then one of the 7 gentlemen will have Maftir and he'll have a double Aliyah. Then he says, if any of the other people who are present are able to do Maftir, then give the Maftir to one of the people who hasn't had an Aliyah yet, rather than doing the same person who had an Aliyah this morning to have again an Aliyah. To have twice an Aliyah in the same morning is not straightforward. It's only when there's no option. So now I'm asking the question, if it's so simple that the Balkoida can take over for Haftorah, so what's all this about? There's no one else in the shul who can do Maftir. Let them do the brachas, and the Balkoida will read the Novi. Possibly the answer to that is that the other 3 people in the shul or more, not only are they not able to read in Yeshaya, but they even will struggle to read the brachas. The brachas before and after they have Torah, they can't handle that either. In that case, if they're so incapable not even to read the brachas, then one of the 7 who had the aliyahs till now will have a double aliyah. But if one of the less capable people is able to do the brachas, then I feel that the recommendation would be, contrary to what I said to this fellow on Friday night, the recommendation would be that let that person who did not have an aliyah, let him have maftir, and you'll read, and let him say the brachas of Haftarah, and you'll read. Right, let's move on to something. So someone is challenging that it says that the Alter Rebbe's wording is if there's no one who's able to be maftir benovi. And I'm kvetching into this if there's no one who's able to read. Okay, good, point taken. Right. Let's move on. So a very common question, we've had this during this past week from half a dozen perhaps, shluchim, asking what's the story of starting Ma'ariv, the second night of Shavuos, davening Ma'ariv early. Now, obviously, in Chabad itself, we daven Ma'ariv on time. We don't do an early Ma'ariv, and that's going back from the Alter Rebbe that we don't do an early Ma'ariv. Although it's difficult, and we know it's difficult, and yet we don't fiddle around with this amount of Ma'ariv. We wait till Nacht, we daven Ma'ariv then. But many shuls and Chabad houses, they will do Ma'ariv early, and so long as it's after Plag HaMincha, with the exception of the first night of Shavuos, where first night of Shavuos, we don't want to cut short the Tamimos, the 49 days of Sfira. Therefore, the first night of Shavuos, not only in Chabad, in many communities, they will stick it out and wait for Ma'ariv till 10:30, whatever it may be. I remember I was once in Leeds for over Shavuos, and it was in the Eitz Chaim, like a United Synagogue type of shul. And they waited till 10:30, whatever. It was more extreme than here. Okay. But what about the second night? Is there any leeway to do Ma'ariv early the second night? So 2 points. Number one, this year, this Shavuos, the second night is Shabbos. And therefore, it's much more straightforward to start Ma'ariv the second night early. From Plag HaMincha, you can do Ma'ariv and make Kiddush, etc. Had it not been such a, let's say it was just Shavuos Wednesday and Thursday. So here we read, this is from the Sefer Nesivim Shtei Shlichus, you got the references there, but here we have from the Levush, who lived about 400-something years ago, and he writes that Ma'ariv, the second night of Yom Tov, whether it's Shavuos, Pesach, or Sukkot, generally Ma'ariv should be left till late, till after nightfall. The reason being, we don't want, if you daven Ma'ariv early, then there is the risk of Melacha being done on that day for the night. So let's say Shabbos came in this past Shabbos, was it 8:30? So the sunset was about 8:45. So let's say if you would daven Ma'ariv 7:30, and then you start your meal at 8:00. So that's still Yom Tov Rishon. What would happen if you put up a soup at boil the soup at 8:00 or 8:15, and it only becomes ready, because it's a small flame, it's only ready at 10:00. So what have you done? You've cooked on the real Yom Tov, which is Yom Tov Rishon. 8:15 was still the real Yom Tov, and it was only for the benefit of after the real Yom Tov, which is Yom Tov Sheni. You're not allowed to prepare from one day to the other. So for this reason, it's customary not to bring Ma'ariv early, so as not to allow, or not to cause the likelihood of Melacha being done on day one for day two. And next point is that on the Luach, on the calendars, it says second night, you can't light candles until 10:15, let's say. So again, because if you light the candles earlier, so then you're preparing on Yom Tov Rishon and benefiting it from Yom Tov Sheni, which is not okay. However, if the meal is going to be eaten early, and if necessary, that is legitimate, so then, let's say you're going to eat the meal at 8:00, then you'd light candles before the meal and you'd make Kiddush at 8 o'clock. That's only if it's very interesting. The Ben Ish Chai says it's a good idea to do the meal early because he talks about the flies being so abundant at sunset. Therefore, start the meal early as you shouldn't have flies in your food. Be that as it may, there is a heter to do the meal earlier on the second evening of Yom Tov, but then you'd have to be very careful not to do any melacha before sunset, which is only going to be for the benefit of after sunset or after nightfall. So that's why it's generally not a good idea, but if it's necessary, it is an option. As I say, this Yom Tov, because it's the second night is Shabbos, no melacha is going to be done in any case, and you're allowed to do melacha because of the Eid of Tafshilin, because you make Eid of Tafshilin, you're allowed to do melacha on Friday for the benefit of Shabbos. Therefore, it's not a problem to do Ma'ariv early and to do Kiddush early, etc. Which brings us kind of to the following question. Here is about the Eid of Tafshilin permits us to cook on Friday for the benefit of Shabbos. So normally on Yom Tov, you're only allowed to cook for the very same day. If I would cook on Yom Tov for after Yom Tov, I would be in violation. So although our Torah allows me to cook Ochel Nefesh, I'm allowed to cook on Yom Tov for the day, but I'm not allowed to cook for after Yom Tov. What would happen if I violated this? If on Yom Tov, I baked something for next week, making a bar mitzvah next week, I needed some extra cakes. So I made some cakes. On Yom Tov, I had spare time in the afternoon, I baked cakes. So do I get malchus? I know it's not legal in this country. If there would be a Sanhedrin, would I get malchus? So there is a get out clause. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon when I made those cakes. But what would happen if at 6 o'clock a bunch of hungry bochurim came through my door? Oh, Baruch Hashem, I've got something to feed them. So then, plausibly, it was usable. It could have been served on the Yom Tov itself. Therefore, I'm not punishable for what I did because it could have been used for the very day. So when is the violation a violation? If I took a steak or something, some meat, which takes 2 hours to cook, and I put it to cook half an hour before sunset, in a way, there's no way it would be ready for the day. So I did an act of cooking, and there's no way it could be edible today. So I did a cooking on the first day, on Yom Tov, for the day after. That's where I would be in violation and get malchus. So let's read this inside. This is in Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, Siman Tov Kuv Chof Zayin, and he says the Erev Tafshilin only permits us to do the needs of Shabbos on Yom Tov only be'oid hayoim gadol, when there's plenty of time before the end of the day. Nehainu sheyesh shehus v'yoim, that there is enough time. But if orchim would suddenly arrive unexpectedly, and they haven't eaten today, so then what you cook today is they're going to be able to eat it now before sunset, before twilight. But if the melacha which you did was so close that there's no time to benefit from the melacha on today, so then that's osur min haTorah to do this. He doesn't talk about the malchus here, but okay. Erev Tafshilin only works Erev Tafshilin doesn't undo something which is forbidden in haTorah. Since people are not so familiar with this halacha, that's why when Yom Tov is on a Friday, it was common custom to do Ma'ariv a little earlier, before nightfall. So that in that way, people knew they have to be in time for Ma'ariv. Therefore, they would make sure that the stuff for Shabbos would be ready before the early Ma'ariv. Okay, so you said before, seems to be even a positive thing, not only just a heter, but even a positive thing to do Ma'ariv early when there's an Erev Tafshilin, which I may have mentioned before. Our minhag is that we skip the first 6 chapters from L'chun Aranano, and we start from Mizmor David, and possibly that's one of the reasons, in order that Ma'ariv should start a little bit earlier. It doesn't work. No mind. All right. So now, according to what we're reading here, if I want to put up a cholent this Friday, so that cholent has to be edible before sunset. Good. Comes along the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch and says very similar. It should be finished before Shabbos, and the food which you put aside to insulate, to keep it warm for Shabbos, should be insulated be'oda yom gadol. He's talking about insulation in a way that it's also going to keep on cooking in some way. It should be edible before Ben Hashmoshes, at least shlish bishulon, at least a third of its cooking. So now let's say a cholent takes an hour and a half to cook. So the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch says, so you can put up your cholent a half an hour before sunset. Now, as you know, I worked on an edition of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch with Psokim, with the decisions of the Alter Rebbe. So someone challenged me and says, how come in that Kitzur Shulchan Aruch we don't have a comment here that the Alter Rebbe disagrees with this heter? So the Alter Rebbe says that the food has to be edible, that you can enjoy it by b'yayim. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch says, so long as it's a third cooked, that's enough. So, according to the Alter, it looks like before you read the Kitzur, you have to put up your cholent an hour and a half before sunset. According to the Kitzur, it's enough to put a half an hour before sunset. It's quite a significant difference. So, how does the Alter Rebbe disagree with this? Now, the source of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch is from the Premier Godim. And we know there's those gangsters known as there's a gangster known as Ben Dursoi. And we know on Shabbos, if you cook raw food and you didn't make it finished, you just made it a third cooked, you'd get punished you'd get punished in Bezdin with all the capital punishment for what? For cooking a raw food and making it edible. Who's it edible for? Oh, there's a gangster called Ben Dursoi. He eats his food on the run. Therefore, you cooked because it's edible for him. So I wrote to him this, my correspondent, I wrote to him this. When it came to skila, in the Bezdin, you said, oh, it's cooked, it's edible for the Ben Dursoi. He can get skila. And now, I cooked on Friday, and before Shabbos came, before sunset, Ben Dursoi could have eaten it. Other people would not. So if Ben Dursoi is a factor to punish Beskila, so Ben Dursoi should equally be a factor to acquit me from Malchus, because it was edible, by B'yom was edible on Friday before sunset. So I felt very strongly that this point which the Premier Godim, the Kitzur, is saying, it's very, very convincing. That so long as the food is edible, even for Bnei Dursoi, if it's edible before sunset, that should be enough. That it shouldn't be, there shouldn't be Isur min HaTorah, and therefore it's permitted to do so. So he answered this correspondent of mine. He writes, but what would happen if someone took food from the fridge, which is a third cooked, and he put it on the fire just 5 minutes before sunset? And in those 5 minutes, it doesn't cook at all, but then it's going to then cook the rest. And in HaShabbos, even though it's past Ben Dursoi, but anything from Ben Dursoi till all the way fully cooked is an act of cooking. So if you take food which is a third cooked, and you put it on the stove on Yom Tov, and it cooks further, and it's no benefit today, only for tonight, then you're in trouble. Which I think is right. I think is right, but if you did the act of putting the cholent up in a half an hour before sunset, I think that would not be a problem. Taking out raw food, a third cooked and making it fully cooked on Yom Tov for Shabbos would be a problem. So I'm really not sure whether we have to make a comment in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch that the Alter Rebbe disagrees. He's talking about placing it there, how long in advance it has to be placed there. He's not talking about taking stuff out of the fridge. He's talking about how long in advance, and he says if it's a third cooked, if you put it in time that a third will be cooked before Ben Hashmoshes, you're okay. Okay, but let's move on. That conversation is ongoing, it's a work in progress. Okay. So last week we had a discussion about lighting candles and whether a man should cover his eyes when he lights the candles. So one of our listeners of the recording asked, he's a boch in yeshiva, and is asking, in his yeshiva, they have dorms, they have like apartments, not in the yeshiva itself, a little bit separate, a few minutes away. I was asking whether the bochrim need to light candles in the dorm. Now, bochrim don't necessarily calculate risks very well, but if I was running a yeshiva, I'd be very anxious about bochrim leaving flames, because they've got a greater degree of confidence that everything's going to be okay. Especially if there's damage, they don't have to pay for it. So now, should the bochrim have to light in their dorms? So the answer is no, not just because of safety or reasons. The word is like this. I asked the bocher, is it your apartment or is it yeshiva's apartment? So sometimes bochrim rent their own apartment. If it's their apartment, then they should be lighting there. But here is the following. The yeshiva provide food and they provide lodging. And part of that provision is also providing lighting. So there's one provider called the yeshiva, which provides food and beds and lighting. One bocher is lighting, should be, I hope it's done in every yeshiva. And when I was in Brunoir, that was done regularly. There were candles in the dining room. One bocher, it was his job. Every Friday, he lit candles, and there was a niche, like a raised up level. And so when we had our meal in the yeshiva, there were those candles which are visible. He made his bracha on behalf of the yeshiva, which is the host, and that bracha was covering for all the food, for all the eating, the lighting where they're eating, and for all the other lighting in the other areas of the yeshiva. And therefore, there's no need for the bochrim to light their own candles, because the boarding and the lighting in the boarding is all provided by the yeshiva, and one bracha has been said, and that is including for all of them. Separate question he asked, does the light in the bathroom, does that count for the mitzvah of hadlochas neiros? And the answer is, I think, yes. You wouldn't make a bracha necessarily, and certainly not inside, but if that's enough for you to be able to use your room safely, to be able to open the door when necessary, that's an ensuite bathroom, and you open the door and then you can see what you're doing in your room, and then when you want to sleep, you close the door. But if that works, that's fine. Yeah. Right, let's move on. So here was a shaila, came to my attention, that in a particular institution, there was a builder, and he accidentally spilt some paint. And then some kids were running around, they didn't realize this paint, and they trod in it, and they perhaps got their clothes damaged, ruined from the paint. So now, does the builder have a duty to pay for the damage caused by the paint left exposed? Now, of course, there's a moral level, but we're talking about strictly lahalocha. So now if I leave something which could cause damage, I did not inflict the damage. I left something dangerous, and the victim came into the damage. So again, it's not that the damage went into him, but he came. So that's called boir. We have in the Torah about a person dug a pit, and then let's say boir b'shusarabim. So then an animal was walking and didn't notice and fell into the pit and gets damaged, hurt, etc., killed. So then the Torah says that the Baal HaBoyer, the one who dug the pit, has to pay the damages. Now here we have in Shulchan Aruch, it's in the Gemara, they brought out in Shulchan Aruch, that if kalim, if utensils fell into the beir, got broken, damaged, the Baal HaBeir, the owner of that damage, cause of damage, is potter, because we learn from the pasuk, "V'nofal shobo sheir eichamer," they will fall therein an ox or a donkey. And the Chazal infer from this, sheir v'loy odom, the liability of the beir, the owner of the beir, is only if an animal fell in. But if a person fell in, so then he's not liable for the damage for the person. Chameir, the Torah says two examples. Sheirei chameir, ox or donkey. Why is it an extra word? Chamoy v'loy kalim. Only if the victim is an animal. But if utensils fell in, then again he's not liable for that damage. Let's read further. V'loy nismat odom ela mimisa. That which the owner of the pit is exempt for payment is only if the person died. But if the person got harmed, had to have hospitalization, treatment, then the one who dug the pit is liable for the damages to his victim. That's said with humans. But for utensils which got damaged, is potter. So for inanimate objects, whether they got totally broken or got damaged, so I left an exposed cause of damage, factor of damage, and utensils got damaged because of it, so the Torah does not oblige me to pay. So therefore the builder was perhaps morally wrong, but is not liable to pay for the damage to the clothing, which are utensils. Now, I just recently was listening to a shiur online. What would happen if, by the next election in Eretz Yisrael, what would happen if there's a overriding majority of Kruma Yidden? Then their Medina would have to run according to halacha. So then how would a lot of stuff is going to be difficult. So this kind of thing, how would this, I don't know, how would it wash? A bit of a pun in this instance, but how would it, so one of the points which they're saying is that the Bezdin would be empowered to enact rules even beyond what's the chiyuv halacha. So if there's going to be for takonas hasiba, for the benefit of the welfare of the community, the Bezdin may apply a penalty, even though, according to Choshen Mishpat, it's not applicable. So what would be if this would come to in a more established community, in a situation whether it would be chayiv beyond the chiyuv of Shulchan Aruch? Possibly, but strictly speaking, according to Shulchan Aruch, the owner of the damage is not liable for the damage. I think there's just one interesting. How much more so it was in a private domain? It doesn't make it worse. One interesting thing is, I think that if you remember, many years ago, there was a factory in India which had a major disaster, and it was a whole discussion: who is liable for disaster? Was it called Bhopal? I don't remember. It could be. Is it the designer? Is it the builder? Is it the owner of the factory? It was like a whole discussion. And at the time, someone asked me a halacha view about it, and just a feeling about this. In civil law, it's either the designer or the architect or the builder or there has to be someone has to pick up the tab. What about the Eibishter? They don't have that. Therefore, someone has to pick up the tab. Grenfell Towers. Who's liable for Grenfell Towers? Keep on pushing around. But in Torah, sometimes there's a damage which Torah says the party who's the cause, he's not punishable. So who gave the damage? It came from Hashem. This person is not liable to pay, and so it's a damage which you'll just see. It's a damage from which was sent by Hashem. Let's go to the chat over here. In your example, one of the Bocher lighting candles for yeshiva, does he dictate Shabbos for all the Bocher? No, I don't think so. It doesn't. The fact that if he lights the candles a little bit early, I don't think that is. He's doing the mitzvah of Adlokas Neiris. He's not doing Kabbalah Shabbos for everyone. For that matter, when a woman lights candles, it doesn't make it Shabbos for her husband. Right, but she's doing the mitzvah for him. Right, let's move on. So here, a boy in my class in the Yeshiva Ketana in Golders Green, he asked me a challenging question. You know, in Chabad, it's quite common for us, especially Shabbos, to daven a little bit later. The latest time for Shema is, well, it's 9 o'clock, 9:30, whatever it is, around then. When we're davening, we're starting Hoidu at 10 o'clock, so by the time you get to Shema, it's too late. So what do? We say Shema earlier. So you wake up, whatever time you wake up, and you say Shema, 3 parshas, and then you yotze with that. So now he's asking, it says in the Gemara, if a person didn't read Shema until after the third hour, he says, what's the rule of the late Shema, which is encapsulated with Yotzer Oir and Avas Oilom and Emes V'Yatzib? It's there. But does it have the din of Shema that you're not allowed to interrupt for many things? Or is it Koire Batoire, allowed to interrupt? This was his question, which I think was a very good question. So I looked around and eventually came to this comment from the Brejana Rov for Das Torah, and he writes the following. Those who read the Shema early in the morning, and then later when they're saying the davening, they're saying Birchas Krishma, and they're saying Shema again. So he says it has the din of Bein HaProkim. If there's 2 levels, there's Emsa HaPerik and Bein HaProkim. So he says it's like Bein HaProkim, although it's the middle of a parsha, but it doesn't have the full impact of in middle of Shema because of Yotzer Shema. And therefore you'd be allowed, whatever you're allowed to answer Bein HaProkim, you'd be allowed to answer there. I'm going to leave that over there, and we're going to go on to the next question. So here, one of our listeners asks me the following. You know, you've got these boards in shuls with the number of the Omer, the day of the week, whatever, and you've got numbers and or letters, and you slide them into a track, and so it becomes Chav Zayin, whatever it could be. Are you allowed to put letters, separate letters, into that slide, into that track, to create a number? Now, there's a separate type, which I haven't seen in years. I'm sure a lot of you remember these peg boards. You had a board which got 1,000 holes, or 5,000 holes, and you have letters which we've got little how do you say, studs at the back, and you fit them in, and it says, bingo at, etc. outside. So to do those, that's not allowed on Shabbos. To put letters in those pegboards. Now, what we're reading over here is that to pin letters onto a surface, that's not okay. But then he says the following. This is from the Piskei Teshuvos. So he writes the following. If you've got letters which are written on a card, and to put them into a track, and they're going to now form words, form a message, so long as they're not held firmly there, then that is okay. That's not an issue. So let's compare to, let's say, a jigsaw puzzle. Are you allowed to make a jigsaw puzzle on Shabbos? So you've got the more, should we say, childish ones, where if you pick up one piece, the rest remain on the table. So to do such a puzzle on Shabbos is okay, because the pieces, therefore the picture hasn't become one unit. You've got the more, should we say, adult puzzles. That's a bit of a Adults playing puzzles is interesting, but never mind. So the adult puzzles, so then you stick them together, then you can pick the whole thing together. That would not be allowed on Shabbos because they've been the parts, and therefore the pictures has become one unit. So what's being said over here, you've got this track, and you put in letters, but they're not stuck there, and they're easy to slide in and out. Therefore, that's not a problem. It's not called writing. Writing is the definition of writing is letters stuck onto a surface. Okay. Now, one of our listeners asks the question: may one use a knife sharpener for fleischiks and milchiks? Does a knife sharpener have to be kosher? Could you go to a local, there may be some facility locally where they've got machines for sharpening knives, a non-kosher place? Could you sharpen your knives there? So the basic answer is that interaction of taste would be with heat and with liquid. So and if that's not there, then that would be okay. So this is from a sefer called Shevet HaKahosi, but this is, I believe, would be accepted across the board. To sharpen a knife, you are allowed to sharpen a knife on a sharpening stone, whatever, even though it may have been used for non-kosher foods. Or you are similarly allowed to sharpen a knife on a flesh knife, on a milk knife with the same sharpener. But then he says, if it's a kind of sharpener which is used, they use a lot of water during the sharpening, then one shouldn't use the same sharpener for one for the other. But if it's just a little bit of water, so then he says that's okay. So basically, generally for a knife sharpener, you can use the same knife sharpener for fleischiks or milchiks, because there's no significant liquid to say it became hot and it took the taste from the knife into the stone and then from the stone back into the knife. All of that is not happening, and therefore it's okay. Right. One of our listeners asks me for a little bit of clarity about pas palter. As you may know, several years ago, the Sephardi Kashrus authority in this country made an arrangement with one of the big baking chains, Warburton's or something, and that their bread should be without any animal fat. And so if let's say you're in Cornwall or whatever it may be, in Stoke-on-Trent, you could go into a shop and buy Warburton's bread, and you know that it doesn't have any tray-free ingredients. Of course, there's the other issue, that it's not pas Yisrael, it's pas, the word palter means bread from a baker. So we do know that there's halacha that Chacham introduced that we shouldn't be buying bread made by a goy. Then we have here, the Shulchan Aruch says the following: there are places they are more lenient and they allow buying bread from a kosher baker where there's no Jewish baker available, because it's a shas adcha, because you need to have something to eat. So they would buy from a kosher baker when there's no Jewish bakery available. Of course, we're not talking about chas v'sholom with tray-free ingredients. We're talking about it's just like French bread, which is just flour and water and salt, but it's made by a goy. So there are places where they would permit using that bread from a kosher bakery. Now, those who would take this heter, even when Jewish bread is available, also to buy the bread from a kosher bakery. So that's what we have here in the Shulchan Aruch. Now we're looking at the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. You're not allowed to eat bread from a goy. There are places where they would buy bread from a kosher baker, where there's no Jewish baker available, or even yes, but it's not as good quality. If it's from a private owner, from a private baker, or from themselves, no. There are those who say that when there's no baker available, you're even allowed to buy from a balabais. No, that's a separate thing. But meanwhile, what we're seeing is there is a little bit of leeway to be able to buy bread from a pas palter from a kosher bakery, when there's no when it's better quality, etc. So that's a yesh oimrim, and that's where these so some people might be make or take a very lenient view. I just want to say, certainly as Chassidim, we don't go for this. And I mentioned this story before, sorry I didn't put it online, that Rabbi Chitrik Chalav Shalom, in his stories, his Rishimas Dvorim, he has a story of when the Rebbe was in Rostov, as in, it's going back 100 years ago, approximately, a bit more than 100 years ago, after 1918, during the revolution, etc. So the Rebbe moved from Lubavitch to Rostov, and the Chassidim asked the question. There is a Jewish baker in Rostov on the other side of town. But that Jewish baker doesn't wash Negelwasser. There's a Goyish baker just around the corner, so who doesn't need to wash Negelwasser. So if a person didn't wash Negelwasser, so there's a Ruach HaTumah. So perhaps they should dafka buy from the Goy who doesn't have a Ruach HaTumah, rather than buying from the Yid who didn't wash Negelwasser as Ruach HaTumah. And the Rebbe said, better buy from the Yid, because this is a Ruach HaTumah, for this one is the Tumah Mamash. So he preferred to buy from the Yid who didn't wash Negelwasser, rather than buying from the Goy, which, as you can see, there's Heterim, Shasat Chak, and etc. And yet he insisted on going to buy from the Jewish baker, despite the apprehensions there. So certainly it's not something which we would go for, but there are those people out there who are going to take that lenient view, follow the lenient view, and Yesh Lahem Amal Ismech. Okay, let's go for our last thing. Now someone's asking, what about Duche de Sakina? Yes, but Duche de Sakina, when it cuts through a food, if you cut an onion with a fleshik knife, so then the onion becomes fleshik. But then there's the fluid in the food which is interacting. But if you rub a trefa knife and a kosher knife, rub them one against the other, and they're both dry, then it would not make one would not make the other one treif. Right. The last thing which we had is, does the Chazan answer Omen at Birchas Chayanim? So although in the Gemara it says the Chazan should not answer Omen when he's leading Birchas Chayanim, because he might lose track, but it's brought in Shulchan Aruch that nowadays, especially if you're holding a siddur in front of you, so then you keep your finger in the place. What doesn't say about keeping your finger in the place, but you can keep track. It's not so much you have to rely on your memory, and therefore the Chazan does answer Amen between, after each of the three brachas of Birchas HaTorah. We have another couple of minutes, so then just to finish off the word of the Rebbe on Rav Yosef. We learned this recently in Gemara Psochim. Rav Yosef is saying, and on the Shavuos, he would say that they should make for him a quality calf for Gishmaka meat, and he says, if not for this day of Matan Torah, how many Yosefs there would be in the shukah, there would be in the marketplace. What does it mean? What's so special about this day? So Rashi says, Shulamaditi Torah v'nistra mamti, that I've learned Torah, Rush Matan Torah, I've learned Torah and have been elevated. There are many other people in the street who are called Yosef. If I wouldn't have learned Torah, what's the difference between me and them? The Rebbe talks about why it's the emphasis b'shukah, what's the shukah. And basically the explanation is that the whole achievement of Matan Torah, the Torah was you didn't learn Torah before also. The others had Torah. Mitzrayim, they were Eden, who knew the parts of Torah. So what's the chiddush of Matan Torah? So there's a famous idea of the Elyonim and Tachtonim to bring Kedusha into this world. That was new by Matan Torah. Until then, there was like this divide that the physical will not become impregnated, so to speak, with the spiritual. And after Matan Torah, you write it the mezuzah, so it has a kedusha, etc. You bring kedusha into this world. So that's the emphasis of the shukah. That there's idea of, and Yosef means to add, to influence. And there's a new word in English called influencers. And so you got a lot of people who say, I'm an influencer. So they are Yosefs. Now there can be Yosefs who do good things, not to be totally cynical. It could be they are inspiring to good things, and that's good. Yeah, they're Yosefs, but they are Yosefs, and they are in the shuk. But what is their influence achieving? Whereas Rav Yosef, who learns Torah, so their Hishof, or their influence is something that's just within the shuk. But Rav Yosef, he says, because he learned Torah, therefore he's able through Torah to have a spiritual input into the shukha, and for that he has every reason to celebrate, and that's why in Shavuos especially, other Yom Tovim may be an option if a person doesn't want to eat, wants to fast, he maybe have a permission. But Dafka and Shavuos, we want to show that we are thankful to Hashem for giving us the Torah. Therefore, Dafka, one should celebrate in a gashmistic way. Someone is asking, does the Chazan answer the Omen of Levarchas Am Yisrael B'Avo? I don't know. I'll have to look that up. All right, I wish you all a guten Yom Tov, Kabbalah Satira, B'Simcha B'Pnimius.
Oh, my God.
Chodesh Tov.
Good Chodesh.